Vampire Survivors was never really for me. I played it a lot on my Steam Deck, and I thought it was pretty good. I played it again on my iPhone when it came out on mobile, and I thought it was pretty good. But I never really connected with it. I never really loved it the way a lot of people I know did. I just found the experience to be a little bit too hands-off. I would wander around the map, and I would pick up XP gems, and I would choose between 3 options, and I'd either have a build that would allow me to stand still and win, or I would die, and then just do it all again. Lather, rinse, repeat. You know? I mean this genuinely. I spent a lot of time playing Vampire Survivors with my eyes actually unfocused or while doing something else entirely. And I fully understand this is a positive to some people, that the low barrier of input allows you to achieve a flow state that propels you through each run. That, coupled with the high-level progression, the unlocks in between runs, and you have a hit on your hands. I understand why Vampire Survivors is such a big deal. It's a loop that's easy to fall into and easy to stick with, and if you get really hooked on it, then you can start looking for all the secrets and all the different levels. You can poke at all the edges. I get it, but Vampire Crawlers, the new game by Ponkel, manages to break free from this podcast game moniker and delivers a sense of strategy that's pretty easy to get into, but eventually demands your attention. And like some of the very best roguelikes I've ever played, achieving a flow state in Vampire Crawlers is possible, but only by mastering its many systems. The two games really feel like two sides of the same coin. They're going after the same conclusion, but courting different kinds of players in the process. And let me tell you, of the two of them, Vampire Crawlers is definitely the one for me. Vampire Crawlers is a first-person, dungeon-crawling, deck-building roguelike, which I think is the right order to put all of those words in. Visually, I would say it's reminiscent of something like an Etrian Odyssey or like a really legitimately old-school first-person dungeon crawler. The environments are heavily pixelated, and a lot of the enemies you run into and the items you find are all pulled right from Vampire Survivors, which again means that they're heavily pixelated. The game has you choosing a crawler, which are just the survivors from Vampire Survivors, and you're moving from floor to floor through each of these dungeons, deciding if you want to fight all of the enemies or not, eventually fighting a boss at the end of each floor, and then moving your way onto the next floor. In Vampire Survivors, each run would last 30 minutes. You would choose a location, you'd try to survive for 30 minutes, and if you did, then, the run would just end there. In Vampire Crawlers, it's not so different. You choose a location, and each of those locations has a set amount of floors, and as long as you beat the boss on that bottom floor, run complete. You succeeded. Good job. This makes Crawlers retain one of my favorite aspects of Vampire Survivors, which is the understanding of how long a run can take. If you know that you have exactly 30 minutes to kill, you can jump into a run of Vampire Survivors and finish it, hypothetically, before that time is up. In a similar vein, runs of Vampire Crawlers really don't take that long. They could probably take up to 30 minutes max, but usually a lot less. But the main method of play in Crawlers is very different than it was in Survivors. Survivors had you playing in a top-down perspective. Enemies would come at you, and you would just kind of stand there or wander around and try to hit the enemies with your auto-attacking weapons and just hope for the best, eventually. Vampire Crawlers being a deck-building roguelike means that there's a lot more strategy involved, just up front. When you bump into an enemy in the dungeon, they will turn into basically a row of enemies. Those enemies will then target you to try and attack you, and you will pull a hand of playing cards. And those cards are direct pulls from items from Vampire Survivors. The very first character you play as has a whip. A whip costs 0 mana to play and will hit all of the enemies in the front row. A magic wand card also costs 0 mana to play, but will target enemies that are specifically trying to attack you on this turn. The King Bible costs 1 mana to play, will do a bunch of damage to all the enemies in the front row, and also has the potential to knock them back a row. This means that if they're planning to attack you, you use the King Bible, you knock them back. Now they're not attacking you. They need to move up a row on the next turn, and then they can try to target and attack you again. Basically, every item that appeared in Vampire Survivors appears in Vampire Crawlers in some way, shape, or form. The spinach, for example, costs 1 mana to play. When you play it, it upgrades your might, which is basically your strength, just for that encounter. That means as you continue cycling through your deck, you can play the spinach over and over and over again and increase your strength for that encounter over and over and over again. It doesn't carry over to the next encounter, but it is really helpful, especially in boss fights where they have a lot of health. The candelabra allows you to do splash damage, which is kind of like an area effect thing, which means that if you attack the front row, you will also do a percentage of that damage to the back row as well. And then, of course, you have cards like armor, which will allow you to mitigate damage that you'll be taking on any given turn. As a person with a pretty good understanding of how most of the items of Vampire Survivors worked, I think they did a really good job translating them into cards or items you can use in a deck builder. Generally speaking, when I unlock a new card, I don't have to ask too many questions about how I think this will affect my play. And in the cases where I do, I just use it anyway and find out for myself. And that's how every roguelike works, to be clear. In almost every roguelike anyone has ever played, there will be questions about terminology, there will be questions about how certain things are expressed in the world, and you just gotta try. You just gotta try and maybe fail and try again, and eventually you'll have this kind of perfect map in your head of how the game works. The only one I don't get actually is Nduya, which it says it adds spicy damage, which I can understand to a certain degree that it's doing more damage than if I didn't use Nduya, but I don't know. I haven't fully figured out the mechanics of how that works, if I'm being honest. Anyway, that's the loop of the game. You choose a character. That character will have a set deck that you start with. They'll also have a certain amount of traits. So, for example, the first character you play as, they do extra damage for every red card you use, which is an attack card. You go into a dungeon, you fight a bunch of enemies, you try to find a bunch of secrets in the process, you fight a boss, you move on to the next floor. You do that over and over again until you either win or lose. When you win or lose, you take the money that you acquired over the course of that run, and you use it to spend on permanent upgrades or new characters or a bunch of other things, which is not so dissimilar from Vampire Survivors. It really is kind of the same exact loop as Vampire Survivors. It's just the way you interact with the world is completely different. One question I have that has me literally scratching my head is that Vampire Crawlers actually has a subtitle. It's called Vampire Crawlers, the Turbo Wildcard from Vampire Survivors. That's the full real name of the video game. One part of me cynically wonders if they're just trying to brand a new genre of video game the same way a lot of people took Vampire Survivors and then started making Survivors likes. Is this Ponkel trying to brand Turbo Wildcard as like a new genre of deck building roguelike? Maybe. And if you break down what they probably mean by Turbo Wildcard, I think the idea is that you're playing the game at an extremely fast pace. I think they want you to achieve that same kind of flow state that you do with Vampire Survivors in Vampire Crawlers as well. And a lot of this is expressed through one specific button. When you have a hand of cards in the game, you can press the X button to just play all the cards at once at the same time. That's for instances where like you're either overpowered enough that it doesn't really matter what cards you use in what order, or alternatively, you don't really care that like you might use the might upgrade card after you use the whip instead of before. But I think this Turbo Wildcard idea is a bit of a misnomer. I don't really think it matches my experience of playing this game. I have found the strategy of it to be compelling and to be interesting, and that means that I'm spending time staring at my cards, deciding what order to play them in. Early on in the game, I don't really think this is that much of an issue. You can just kind of play whatever cards you want in whatever order, and it'll probably be fine, but even then, they introduced this idea of mana sequencing that does make it compelling to play cards in a certain order. Say you start with 3 mana and you have a card in your hand that costs 0 mana, a card that costs 1 mana, and a card that costs 2 mana. If you play the 0 card and then the 1 card will be more powerful than if you had just used the 1 card by itself. If you play the 1 card and then the 2 card will also be more powerful than if you just played it by itself. Literally right from the beginning of the game, like from the tutorial, they are telling you it behooves you to play these cards in a certain order if possible. It makes every single hand that you're playing a little tiny puzzle that you need to solve. Already, that kind of deviates from this idea of just play whatever whenever you want. You can turn your brain off. You can play this just like Vampire Survivors. I don't think that's really true. That really gets down to the crux of like what I think game criticism is, which is looking at what the game tells you it is and then figuring out what it actually is in your own personal experience playing it. And in my experience, the more of Vampire Crawlers I play, the more demanding it is, the more it's asking of me. The game gets more difficult as time goes on. It unlocks more difficult versions of each level. It unlocks more difficult levels. And the more of them I play and the deeper I get into the game, the more time I need to spend staring at my cards and deciding what sequence and what order to play them in. I spend more time sitting there and deciding which of the 3 options I'm going to choose from. In Vampire Survivors, it was more about just like kind of hoping through the luck of the draw. You would get a bunch of items that would start to synergize together, allow you to evolve these items and weapons and things like that. And eventually you'd just like have a build that would work or it wouldn't work. And, you know, that it was a little bit up to chance. In Vampire Crawlers, I feel like I have a lot more agency over every single decision in the game because for the most part, the game is not playing itself. It's not choosing which attacks should go off at which intervals. I am sitting there looking at a hand of playing cards and deciding which one should be played in which order. When they ask me to choose a new card or get rid of a card or upgrade a card, that's a big decision. There's a real element of skill and strategy involved that actually demands your attention. I think this Turbo Wildcard idea actually undersells the game to the people who probably like it the most, especially as you get further into the game and you start unlocking more characters that you can play as, you start unlocking more cards and more gems. I'll talk about gems in a second, but more gems that can, you know, enter into the item pool as you start unlocking different arcana, which will change how each run plays. And then obviously as you start unlocking the different dungeons that you can make your way through, it gets really interesting. A quick side note on gems as a mechanic, just because I like gems a lot. A lot of the cards will have little gem slots, and as you make your way through a dungeon, if you unlock a chest, or sometimes even when you level up, you'll get to choose a gem, which you can then slot into those gem slots. So suddenly, a whip, which costs 0 mana and does 8 damage to all of the enemies in the front row, can be a lot more valuable and a lot more interesting if you, for example, get a gem that does double damage. So now you're doing 16 damage to all of the enemies in the front row. Or you get a gem that increases your might stat, or your splash damage stat, or just gives you armor. The gems get really interesting, I've found. There are some gems where they actually incentivize you to not use certain cards. So if you have a card with like a really high mana cost and you find that you can't really use it that often, you can give it this leader gem, which makes it so all of the other cards you use instead of the one that has the leader gem in it will do more damage as long as you still have the leader gem in your hand. But then there's other like really strategic gems that I'm obsessed with. For example, you can get a card that's a tome that gives you more mana on that turn. And you can slot a gem in there that duplicates that card in your hand. That means that you can just get like a bunch of mana and just do basically every single attack possible, especially as you increase your hand size over the course of a run. Really helpful to have a self-replicating mana tome. This is what I mean about the strategy of vampire crawlers. It starts to, over time, ask a lot more of you, and its strategy becomes very, very deliberate in a way that Vampire Survivors, to me at least, felt a little bit like it was leaving more up to chance. But when I say both games are kind of two sides of the same coin, I don't think that it's in the way Ponkel intended. Once again, this Turbo Wildcard moniker does imply that you're supposed to be able to turn your brain off and play this game, but I actually think it aligns much closer to some of my favorite roguelikes of all time. A game like The Binding of Isaac really becomes a flow state game once you've played like literally hundreds of hours of it. The Binding of Isaac has an item pool that feels like insurmountable. It feels like the kind of game where the possibility space is just completely endless. But eventually you get to a point where you start to get a handle on what kinds of items you should and shouldn't be taking. You start to understand more about how runs should and can work. The Binding of Isaac eventually goes from this bullet hell nightmare where everything is out to get you and anything is possible into something that feels a lot more contained and allows you to achieve this flow state. Spelunky, which I think is one of the best games ever made, also kind of comes at it from the same perspective where there are a lot of different things that can interact with each other in Spelunky. But eventually, over time, you start to kind of internalize everything that's possible in Spelunky. And yes, you're seeing new generated versions of what's happening in Spelunky every time you play, but you start to encounter the same kinds of experiences enough that they become learned behaviors for you. And once again, you start to achieve a flow state. It doesn't mean you won't die, but it does mean you can kind of make your way through something that used to be dangerous with a little bit more ease than before. I think Vampire Crawlers is actually closer to that style of video game. I do think over time, as you start to internalize this idea of mana sequencing, and you start to find characters that you really like, and you start to understand that like certain colors of cards will interact and synergize with each other as well as this mana sequencing of it all, you start to get to a point where the puzzles become easier to solve just because you've done them a lot. I think there's a version of a person playing this game who would experience that and probably see it as a negative. They would say that the game gets like too easy over time because the puzzles become kind of a solved problem, kind of like tic-tac-toe maybe. But personally, I kind of see that as the reward for the time invested. You've spent the hours and you've spent all this time going through run after run after run, learning all the different permutations of what's possible in Vampire Crawlers. Your reward is that you can kind of sit back and enjoy the experience as you slowly start to unlock new things that reshape that experience. That's cool. I think that's cool, at least. I think regardless of the intention and the execution, Ponkel did kind of a brave thing here. They could have just made Vampire Survivors sequels forever. They could have just continued to dump DLC into that game, and instead they chose to make a pretty radical left turn and try something different that is going after a different audience. And one of the more brilliant things about it is that it uses the shared language of Vampire Survivors to bring some of those people into the fold if they are interested in a game like this as well. It's things as simple as enemies dropping gems, which fill up an experience bar at the top of your screen. Filling up that experience bar allows you to choose from 3 options, sometimes 4 if your luck is high enough. But it's also stuff like, if you have certain cards in your inventory, you can eventually evolve them into stronger weapons. If the future of Ponkel is just them taking Vampire Survivors and turning it into other equally addicting and good roguelike experiences, then, you know, that's a fine that's a fine direction for them to take, especially if it continues to generate things that I like as much as vampire crawlers. And I think if you're like me and you maybe bounce off of Vampire Survivors, give this a shot. It might click for you the same way it did for me. That's going to be it for me on this one. Thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. Do all the things people always say. You can head over to patreon.com/wavelengths if you want to support the project. Get a ton of videos that I'm constantly making that are Patreon exclusive. And also, yes, I did get a haircut. Bye, everyone.